I have entitled my presentation Unexpected African-Indian Relations, because one of the focus points of my research has been to look at cultural and intellectual exchange. As you can see in my initial in this slide, which covers the main themes, the overwhelming focus on African-Indian relations is often on the economic and political realms. But as my research focuses on, other interests were often invisible, but also ongoing and sustained in the cultural and intellectual realms, religious realms, and even provided the reasons for translocal goodwill. So in other words, what I mean to say is Africans and Indians over many decades, more than a century, have talked about having some common cultural, intellectual, religious understandings. And of course, also a shared resistance, if I can use a fairly strong word, against homogenization under Western domination and supremacy. So I will talk about some of these themes in my comments. The second point, the ambassador alluded to this, and Mira did as well. West Africa has a relatively smaller Indian diaspora and a newer Indian diaspora as compared to East Africa and Southern Africa. And therefore, we must also differentiate the kinds of relationships West Africans and Indians have had. In other words, I don't believe we should simply see one set of West Indian African relations, but there are many Indias for Africans and there are many Africas for India. And finally, West Africa, because of its long-standing ties to the Atlantic world, to the Western Hemisphere, to Europe, through the transatlantic slave trade, which lasted more than 400 years, as well as other kinds of trades and relationships. The relationship between West Africa and India also must be put on this ground of the Atlantic world. So ideas about or practices of capitalism, modernity, European attitudes about white supremacy, for example, we can see by looking at those themes that West Africa and India forged unique relationships. So let me start by just covering very briefly some of the early movements between West Africa and India that people don't often realize. Yes, the British territories of Sierra Leone, Gold Coast, today Ghana, Nigeria, also Gambia, were places where some Indian workers came under the aegis of the British Empire, notably railway workers, become in the early 20th century, in the early 1900s. But there were other sorts of movements. And here I show us two images of the Hamadiyah movement in Islam, which was a Muslim missionary movement, which started in Punjab. Well, the sect started in Punjab in 1889, but then they began sending missionaries by the early 1900s. And by the 1920s, there were these Punjabi missionaries in West Africa. And you can see on the left-hand side that one of the meeting places for West Africans and Indians was in London, not surprisingly, the seat of empire. But the point that I want to make is that Indians and Africans found each other in Europe as they traveled for different reasons. Colonized Indians and colonized West Africans found each other and then developed these sorts of relationships. The West Africans invited the Punjabi missionaries in the 20s, and by the 1970s, you can see on the right side, there was a distinctive West African, particularly in Ghana, but also somewhat in Nigeria, southern Nigeria particularly, Hamadiyas, African Hamadiyas, who maintained a long-standing relationship with India and Pakistan after partition through this encounter. Now, one of the interesting connections that I make in my research is that the Indian government, these missionaries movement preceded the formation of the independent states in South Asia, independent countries. And after India became independent in the 1950s, the government of India recognized that there had been religious missionaries from the Indian subcontinent in Africa, and in fact debated and discussed in Nehru's government, should we send more religious missions? And if you see here in the first bullet, I discuss how the government sent Hindu swamis as well to British Africa, not just East Africa, but to as far as Congo, Ghana, Nigeria, and other places. And if you see in the second bullet point, what I suggest is that these swamis actually encountered the Muslim Ahmadis who were already resident, the Punjabis already resident in West Africa, and wanted to suggest to the Indian government that Indians should establish a center that was completely multi-religious and multiracial, in which the people gathering for philosophic and religious discussions would have the opportunity of forming their own views. So my point here is the idea of religious exchange, intellectual and cultural exchange, those ideas were percolating in the Indian government response or idea for outreach. So not only were political economic affairs on the agenda of the government of India, but also these other kinds of relationships. And I would like to emphasize here too that, I mean, if you look at India after its independence, it was a relatively poor country, and was proud of that heritage in some sense, that India had gained independence from Britain as poor people and as culturally rich. And so culture was a point of exchange and post-colonial self-identification. You see other examples of Africa-India connection through religious organizations like the Muslim Welfare Organization that sent visitors throughout the continent of Africa, and also the Aga Khan's own activism on the African continent. And in fact, I would just briefly mention that some of the offshoots of these kinds of interactions, you can see on the left-hand side from the Hindu monastery of Africa, which is located in Accra, in Ghana. There is a Hindu community among Africans in Ghana that has its own distinct history. You see on the right side, this is not West Africa, but a Ugandan Buddhist monk who actually started as a student in India. So I think this is a very interesting overlaps between the cultural goods from India that Africans were interested in, including religious texts and pictures, and also African travelers to India who went for educational reasons, like Bante Buddha Karakita, but who also imbibed or entered a spiritual conversion and took back a different sort of mission to the African continent. So here we have to think about different kinds of flows of migration, even between the African and Indian spheres. So the government of India realized by the 1950s that there was an independency, a cultural independency among Africans. This quote from Sri Akbar Pant, one of the first Indian diplomats in Africa sent by Nehru. He served in East Africa as well as in West Africa. And he argued that West Africa would always remain unique in its character. Now, the Indian Council on Cultural Relations had this different approach to East Africa and West Africa. And what I want to emphasize here, these are quotes from the texts, is that when they say that African in East Africa was backward educationally, what I believe was, if you look at the full text, what was really under discussion was also that the Indian government had to grapple with the negative or the politically tense relationships between Africans in India and East Africa, which is a point I will come to. And many of the first East African students who went to India to study were very hesitant because they feared racism. So it's important to think about the historical context. In Kenya, for example, this was the era of the Mau Mau uprising, but also the British declaration of the state of emergency that created an enormous amount of violence. The historian Sana Iyer has worked on this and written a very good book. So these were very, these relationships should be kept in a historical time also to think about. So now I do want to turn to Senegal, where the ambassador himself is, and he can attest that it's a very special country. And here you see after Nehru's time, during Indira Gandhi's time, the first president of Senegal, Leopold Sédar Senghor, visiting India. And he was as students of African history know, that he was a very important philosopher, because he also articulated the platform of negritude, that is the celebration of Blackness as a universal cult civilization, as a artistic, literary, philosophical civilization in the world. And this is important because the Europeans had denied that Africans had had any civilization before the Europeans arrived on the African continent. So Senghor was very instrumental in creating a very distinct relationship between this country and India. But I argue also because he was an elder statesman, a senior statesman in the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, and very much looked up to, even though he had his enemies on the African continent, he was a Pan-African leader as well. So this is a very long passage that I don't want to, you can read it, but the point, the ambassador to Senegal in 1962, Raj Kumar, he had toured Senegal, but also gone to Burkina and other French West African countries. And he argues that Africans were more interested in spiritual and philosophical exchange with India than people had ever realized before. He says in the first part that people were disappointed by his doctorate in political science, and they preferred philosophy. And he says they like our cultural values and our indigenous customs, which are so different from those of Europe, which they know. So you can see in the center, the long passage, that Indians were suggesting, Africa, West Senegal and other countries will develop materially, technologically, but a big factory or a big hydroelectric scheme they can see anywhere in the world. And with French and American aid, they too can have these and will have these in due course. But what they wanted to do with India was to forge a civilizational connection. That is to say, if you think about what we learn in school, how much do we learn about, what do we learn about Indian history? What do we learn about African history? I think Raj Kumar's comments were suggesting that we need really a post-colonial intellectual curriculum and exchange in which people living in these new countries can learn about each other, but also find value in our history. So Senghor also had a relationship with a very important and interesting Indian leader named Malcolm Adiseshaya, who was a Christian Tamil, who became the director of UNESCO from 1950. And if Senghor had been schooled at French universities, and of course the UNESCO headquarters was in Paris. Senghor, as a post-colonial citizen of French West Africa, had a close relationship, in fact, that he was criticized for, with France. And so these two men had a natural connection. They also had an interesting connection because they were both Catholics, in minorities in their country. Senegal is, something like 95% Muslim. Malcolm Adiseshaya was part of the Christian minority in India. And so Senghor learned and developed through his study in France about historical linguistics, which at that time was very focused on Indo-European, including Sanskrit, Indo-European languages, but also Dravidian languages of South India, and also African linguistics. And in his studies, he had become very interested in this idea of Africa, India being connected in early historical times, that is to say, by a land bridge or being connected continents. And this idea that Sumati Ramaswamy has talked about, the Lemuria, that Tamil leaders, also intellectual and political leaders, were very captivated by. And so Senghor wanted to make this the basis of Senegalese South Indian connections, that is to say, Dravidian connections. So again, I want to emphasize here, there was not this general idea of India in West Africa, but a more refined, specific idea that there are different regions, different languages spoken in the Indian subcontinent. Adi Seshaya, also from his position, had seen that East African students who had initially won scholarships to study in India did not want to go. They were worried, they were scared. They also, the politics of the nationalist movements on the African continent had also shaped their outlook. So he was very eager to work with Senghor, and they developed this close friendship. 1962, the opening of the Indian embassy in Dakar, and Les Amis de l'Inde, a cultural organization, was also founded in Dakar. So I just want to trace that this relationship goes back far. You also have the colonial French territories in India sharing similar histories, perhaps more similar histories with West African French colonies than even British, British controlled areas. And this is, for the students who are out there, these are areas we could use more research on. What were the discussions in newspapers, nationalist newspapers, about independence from France, and being kind of islands in this French Indian islands in the sea of British territories. Just quickly, also, again, if you take how the ambassador to Kenya and later to West Africa, Appa Punt, saw the merging of all these cultural citizens of post-colonial countries, what they could develop as a new personality. And you see at the end of the left side, Punt's quote, "A new man for the modern age," that from all backgrounds, African, Indian, Islamic, Christian. So this idea of a cultural synthesis was very important to the government of India. And Senghor, for those of you who read French, his address, and I gave Professor Modi the address from Senghor in creating an Afro-Indian Studies department, or Indo-African Studies, whichever you put first. He argued much the same, that there could be this new kind of person coming from the global South, coming from the post-colonial world, who understood and knew the civilizations that were not without emphasis on Europe, but rather between Asia and Africa, India and West Africa. So some activities that were existing between India and Senegal. Senghor chaired the Gandhi Centenary in 68, 69. And by that time, a Senegalese director of UNESCO had taken over, M. Amadou Matar. The Indian Council on Cultural Relations, which establishes many of the scholarships, most of the scholarships at the public universities, the government universities in India, developed many scholarships between Senegal and India. And then with Senghor's backing, a Department of Indo-African Studies was established at the University of Dakar, today Cheikh Anta Diop University, at l'Institut Fondamental d'Afrique Noire, the Institute of Black Africa, and Anamale University in Chidambaram. Again, we could use much more research about these relationships. Now, quickly, so I don't go over my time. So Senghor welcomed a contingent of Indian scholars to come to Senegal and live there and do linguistic research on the connections between West African languages, Wolof, Serer, in Senegal, and Dravidian languages in South India. And he brought a couple, the Upadhyayas, and you see Sushila, Dr. Sushila, who was a noted linguist, who worked on Tulu and other language families in South India. She's receiving an award from Senghor in this picture. She has passed away. Her husband, Professor U.P. Upadhyaya, I had the honor to interview him in 2015 in Mangaluru, and he has also since passed away. Both of them were researchers in Senegal from 1973 to 1980. And they have there's a short book about their life, and it's just one chapter on this period, but they were really influenced in many ways by their time living in Senegal. And likewise, they left a nice memory of India in Dakar and Senegal, where they did field visits. They had taught Hindi classes, were very culturally immersed. Here you see a picture that I was able to take a picture of from a Professor Souleymane Faye, who was a Senegalese professor who studied in Annamale University. And you can see here, at the bottom right of the picture is one of the African professors. I don't know if the other one was here. There were three who two of them I interviewed. Three of them lived in South India for several years. And of course, Puducherry or Pondicherry was sort of comfortable for them because there were many people then who spoke French. Their English was not so good. They talked to me about how it was living as African students in India in the 1970s. So the main points from their research, as the ambassador said, some of this research did take root, others of it didn't. Of course, linguists and historians have also since challenged their research, but this is of course part of scholarly dialogue, is you have challenges. So not only Indo-Europeans contributed to the development of ancient civilizations, but also African and Dravidian civilizations. The Indian linguists were present at the Senegalese representation in 1977 to the World Festival of Black Arts and Cultures held in Lagos. I think that's a very important point to emphasize, that Indian scholars doing research on Africa represented African governments. Another point was there were many kinds of cultural mixing or métissage in world history. This was one of Senghor's very important themes. No culture is pure. And then they had developed this 200-word list of shared vocabulary between Wolof in West Africa, Atlantic West Africa, and Tamil and other languages like Chabi, which for key, which is probably a Portuguese sort of import or influence. And then that both of these places on the West African coast and on the South Indian side were carrefour or meeting places of culture. I can talk more about this if people are interested. This is the separate representations or experiences that Professor Upadhyaya conveyed to me, and also Souleymane Faye, Upadhyaya living in Senegal and Faye living in South India, how it felt for them. So in conclusion, I hope we haven't lost the imagination in today's world for intellectual and cultural exchange. More studies of African Indian cultural exchange, I argue, are important because we have come to a point where emphasizing economic, political, technological development seems the best pathway forward for the future. But in fact, in the 1960s and 70s, in the post-colonial era, the greatest excitement was about thinking about how post-colonial peoples will rewrite history and rewrite philosophy from our perspectives. And I have taken from a Senegalese philosopher, Souleymane Bachir Diagne. He highlights that Senghor has a continuing legacy. And I think you can see from my lecture that Senghor had a very special vision about incorporating Africa, India together. And this is against the backdrop of the expulsion by Idi Amin of Asians from from Uganda in 1972. So there were different ways of relating to India on the African continent, but I think Senghor had a vision that is quite lasting. And again, he says, can we say Senghor's vision has continued without Senghor? Can we say Nehru's vision has continued without Nehru in some sense? And then finally, India, or another point, India's non-monetary role in Africa. India and China have had a competition on the African continent, but even in these early decades of the post-colonial period, India was always distinct from China because of these cultural connections. And some of these connections that figures like Senghor and Pant shared, this dream of a world citizen that a person who knew history and knew philosophy and knew about religions and knew about languages and culture and diversity. And my final point, sorry for going over time, the cultural attachments. These cultural attachments I've been speaking about often preceded the economic ties and actually make them stronger. They are not separate, they are very much connected.